She thought she'd escaped the ocean's memory. But some silences grow roots in salt and stone. Her mother left her a house that remembered everything. The water doesn't call to you. It just waits. What inheritance did you never ask to carry? The house waited for her like it had been holding its breath. Leora stepped out of the car and tasted salt before she saw the ocean. It sat heavy on her tongue. Metallic, ancient, wrong in a way she couldn't name. The air pressed against her skin, damp and cold even though it was June. 23 years since she'd been anywhere near water, this endless. 23 years since her father, Cullen, drowned, and her mother, Vesa, packed them inland, into silence, into safety. She hadn't expected to come back. The house stood small and crooked against the sky, shutters peeling blue paint in long curls like skin after sunburn. Salt crusted the windows so thick the light inside looked underwater, dim, greenish, trembling. The porch sagged on one side. The mailbox leaned at an angle that felt deliberate, like it had given up slowly. Leora pulled the brass key from her pocket. She'd found it in her mother's jewelry box 3 days after the funeral, wrapped in tissue paper that smelled faintly of lavender. No note, no label. Just the key, warm in her palm, and a single line written on the tissue in her mother's neat script. You'll know when. She didn't know, but here she was. The lockbox on the porch had held the house key, the deed, and an address she didn't recognize until she looked it up. Coastal, remote. Bought 6 months before her mother died. Leora had never heard her mention it. Not once. Vesa didn't talk about the ocean. She didn't talk about Cullen. She didn't talk about before. Leora pushed the gate open. It didn't creak. That surprised her. Everything else looked like it should make noise. The warped boards, the rusted hinges, the shutters barely holding on. But the gate swung smooth and silent, and that felt worse somehow, like the house had been expecting her. She climbed the steps. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. She could hear the ocean from here. Not just the sound of it, the weight of it, rhythmic, endless. The kind of sound that didn't stop even when you closed your eyes, even when you pressed your palms over your ears. It just kept coming. Crash and pull, crash and pull. Leora turned the key. The door opened into stillness. Not emptiness. Stillness. The air inside tasted like brine and damp wood, and beneath that, something faintly sweet. Not flowers. Not rot exactly. Something in between. She stepped inside, and the floorboards answered her weight with a low groan that traveled through the walls like a sigh. The furniture was still here. A couch covered in faded linen. A table by the window with 2 chairs. Dust everywhere, but not the kind that builds over years. This was thinner, fresher, like someone had been here recently and then left in a hurry. Leora walked to the window. The ocean stretched out beyond the glass, gray and restless under a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to storm. She pressed her fingers to the sill and felt the grain of old wood, smooth in some places, splintered in others. The brass key sat heavy in her other hand. She didn't know what it opened, but she knew, in a way that made her chest tighten, that it wasn't the front door. Behind her something shifted. Not a sound, not movement exactly, just a change in the air. A sense that the house had noticed her noticing it. Leora turned. The hallway stretched dark and narrow toward the back of the house. No lights on, no windows, just shadow pooling at the end like water collecting in a low place. She should unpack the car. She should open the windows. She should do anything except stand here, listening to the house breathe. Because it was breathing. Not loud, not obvious. But there, beneath the crash of the waves, beneath the creak of settling wood, a low hum, rhythmic, almost like a pulse, coming from somewhere under the floor. Leora's pulse answered it. She crossed the room slowly, following the sound to the far corner where the floorboards met the wall. She knelt, pressed her palm flat against the wood. It was cold, damp, and beneath her hand, the hum kept going, steady, patient, like something waiting. She pulled her hand back. The hum continued. Leora stood and walked to the door, her legs unsteady, her breath shallow. She stepped outside onto the porch, and the ocean roared louder now, filling the silence she'd left behind. The brass key was still in her fist. She looked down at it. Small, ordinary, entirely unremarkable, except for the fact that her mother had left it for her with no explanation. You'll know when. Leora didn't know, but she was here. And the house, this strange, waiting house, knew her name. She could feel it. By morning, the house felt less like a threat and more like a question. Leora opened the windows and let the salt air push through the rooms, scattering dust motes into golden light. The kitchen overlooked the water. She hadn't noticed that last night. Now, standing at the sink with her hands under cold tap water, she could see the entire horizon, gray and restless, and impossibly wide. She unpacked slowly, clothes into the bedroom dresser, books onto the shelf by the couch, her mother's jewelry box on the nightstand, still wrapped in the scarf Vesa used to wear on Sundays. Leora didn't open it. She just let it sit there, small and quiet, like it was waiting for permission. The brass key she left on the windowsill above the sink. She told herself she'd figure it out later. The floorboards creaked as she moved through the house, answering her footsteps with soft groans that sounded almost conversational. The hum from last night was gone, or maybe she just couldn't hear it in the daylight. Either way, the house felt different now, smaller, almost ordinary. She was making coffee when someone knocked, not loud, not urgent. Just 3 soft taps, polite and patient. Leora opened the door to a man holding a loaf of bread wrapped in linen. He was older than her by maybe 10 years, weathered in the way people get when they live near the ocean their whole lives. His hair was gray at the temples. His hands were calloused. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ashen," he said. "I live next door. Thought you might need this." She took the bread. It was still warm. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Leora." "I know." That stopped her. He noticed. His smile softened into something more apologetic. "Small town," he said. "Word travels. Someone buys the old house. People talk." Leora nodded slowly. "How long has it been empty?" 11 years. He said it without hesitation, like he'd been expecting the question. Leora leaned against the doorframe, the bread heavy in her hands. "Did you know the person who lived here before?" Ashen's face changed. "Not much. Just enough." "A little," he said. His voice was low now, careful. She kept to herself, mostly. What happened to her? He looked past Leora into the house, like he was searching for something he'd lost a long time ago. Then his eyes came back to hers. "She lost her daughter to the water," he said quietly. "After that, she couldn't stay." The ocean crashed behind him, louder now, or maybe Leora was just hearing it differently. "That's terrible," she said. Ashen nodded. It was. He didn't say anything else, neither did she. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, just weighted, like there were more words underneath the ones they'd already spoken. Finally, Ashen stepped back. "If you need anything," he said, "I'm just through the trees." "Thank you," Leora said again. He nodded once and turned, walking down the path with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched against the wind. Leora closed the door. She set the bread on the counter and looked around the kitchen. The light was still good. The air still smelled like salt and wood, and something faintly sweet she couldn't name. Everything felt normal, except the brass key wasn't on the windowsill anymore. Leora stared at the empty space where she'd left it. She turned slowly, scanning the counter, the table, the floor. Nothing. She walked into the living room, checked the couch, the bookshelf, the mantel. Still nothing. Her chest tightened. She retraced her steps. Back to the kitchen. Back to the window. The key wasn't there. She hadn't moved it. She was sure she hadn't moved it. But there it was, sitting on the dining table, next to the vase she'd unpacked that morning. Leora picked it up. It was warm, like someone had been holding it. She closed her fist around it and told herself she was being ridiculous. She must have put it there and forgotten. That was the only explanation. She'd been distracted, tired, grieving. Of course she'd forgotten. But she didn't believe it. That night she found the photograph. It was tucked inside a cabinet above the stove, wedged between two old plates covered in dust. Leora pulled it out carefully, her fingertips brushing the edges. The paper was thick, glossy, faded at the corners. A little girl stood on the beach, barefoot, holding a shell in both hands. She was maybe 9 years old. Her hair was dark and tangled by the wind. Her expression was serious, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. Leora's breath caught. The girl looked exactly like her. Not similar, not close, exactly. Same narrow face, same sharp chin, same eyes that tilted slightly downward at the outer corners. Leora turned the photo over. No date, no name, just a single word, written in faded ink. Senna. She didn't know anyone named Senna. She stared at the photograph for a long time, her pulse loud in her ears, her hands trembling just enough to make the image blur. The girl in the picture looked back at her, unsmiling, holding her shell like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the ground. Leora set the photograph on the table next to the brass key. The house creaked around her. The ocean whispered beyond the glass. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, something hummed. Leora couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark with the photograph on the nightstand beside her, Senna's face turned toward the ceiling like she was watching. The ocean murmured beyond the glass. The house settled around her with soft groans that sounded almost like conversation. She kept thinking about the key, about how it had moved, about how warm it felt in her hand, like it remembered being held. At 2 a.m, she stopped pretending to rest. She got up, pulled on her mother's old cardigan, and walked barefoot through the house with the brass key in her fist. The floorboards answered her steps. The hum beneath them pulsed faintly, rhythmic and patient, like a heartbeat waiting to be found. Leora followed it, through the living room, past the kitchen, down the narrow hallway she hadn't fully explored yet. At the end, half hidden behind a stack of old furniture, was a door. She hadn't noticed it before. Or maybe she had and didn't want to see it. Either way, it was there now. Narrow, wooden, painted the same faded blue as the shutters outside. There was a lock. Leora held the brass key up to the dim light filtering through the window. She already knew it would fit. The lock turned with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. The door swung open into darkness that smelled like mildew and old paper and something faintly sweet. Lavender, maybe, though she couldn't be sure. Leora found the light switch. A single bulb flickered on, casting weak yellow light over a narrow staircase leading down. She descended slowly, one hand on the railing, the other still gripping the key. The air grew colder with each step, damper. The walls were bare stone, slick with condensation. The stairs groaned under her weight like they'd been waiting a long time for someone to use them. At the bottom, the basement opened into a small room. Boxes, dozens of them. stacked against the walls, piled on a warped wooden table, crowding the floor. All of them sealed with tape that had yellowed and curled at the edges. Leora pulled the nearest box toward her and tore it open. Letters. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. All addressed to Leora. None of them opened. Her breath caught. She picked one up. The envelope was brittle in her hands. The ink faded, but still legible. The postmark read, 32 years ago. The return address was this house. The handwriting was her mother's. Leora's chest tightened. She opened the letter carefully, unfolding the paper with trembling fingers. It smelled like lavender, like Vesa, like the scarf she used to wear on Sundays. The letter began, "Dear Leora." But Leora hadn't been born 32 years ago. She read anyway. "I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if I'll ever send it. But I need to write it down, or I'll forget how to breathe. Cullen drowned 3 months ago. They say it was an accident. They say the tide took him. But I know better. He went out there because he couldn't carry it anymore. The weight of staying, the weight of me, the weight of what we'd done. I'm pregnant. I haven't told anyone. I don't know how to say it out loud yet. This baby wasn't supposed to happen, not after we lost." The sentence stopped. Leora turned the page, but there was nothing else, just that unfinished line hanging in the air like smoke. She set the letter down and opened another. She's walking now, 3 steps before she falls. I keep waiting for her to say my name, but she won't. She just stares at the water like she's listening to something I can't hear. I named her Senna. After the flower, after forgiveness. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. Leora's hands shook. She opened another, and another, and another. Each one described a daughter, a house by the sea, a man who drowned, a choice that couldn't be undone. Each one was addressed to Leora. None of them had ever been sent. By the time she reached the last box, the sun was starting to rise. Pale gray light seeped through the narrow basement window, cutting through the dust motes floating in the stale air. Leora sat on the cold stone floor, surrounded by open letters, her mother's handwriting covering the pages like ghosts made of ink. She understood now. Vesa had lived here, before Leora was born, before everything. She'd had another life, another daughter, another version of herself that drowned when Cullen did. Senna, the girl in the photograph, the daughter who walked into the ocean at 9 years old and never came back. Leora picked up one of the last letters. This one was dated 27 years ago, the year Leora was born. "I'm leaving today. My sister will take the house. She says she'll care for it. I don't believe her, but I can't stay. Every room here remembers Senna, every floorboard, every breath of salt air. I'm pregnant again. A girl. I'm going to name her Leora, after light, after starting over. I won't tell her about this place. I won't tell her about Senna. I won't tell her about Cullen or the water or the way grief becomes a house you can't leave even when you run. I'll give her a different life, somewhere inland, somewhere safe, somewhere silent. Maybe that's enough." Leora's throat tightened. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. The brass key sat heavy in her lap. It wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a confession. Her mother had carried this silence for her entire life. She'd run from this house, from this ocean, from the memory of a daughter she couldn't save. And then she'd bought it back 6 months before she died, and left it to Leora without explanation, without warning, without mercy. Leora sat in the basement until the light turned gold. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just breathed. The house creaked above her. The ocean whispered beyond the walls. And somewhere beneath her, the hum kept going, steady, patient, waiting. Leora found Ashen in his garden, pulling weeds from between rows of lavender. She stood at the edge of his property, with the photograph in one hand and a letter in the other. The wind had picked up overnight. It pulled at her hair, her clothes, the paper trembling between her fingers. He saw her and straightened slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. She didn't wait for him to speak. "You knew," she said. Not a question, a statement. Ashen's face changed, not surprise, just resignation, like he'd been waiting for this moment and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. "Yes," he said quietly. Leora walked toward him, her legs unsteady, her breath shallow. She held up the photograph. "Who is this?" Ashen looked at the image for a long time, his jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice was rough, like he was pulling the word up from somewhere deep. "That's Senna," he said. "Your cousin." The world tilted. Leora stared at him. "My cousin?" "Yes. The woman who lived here before was your aunt," Ashen said. "Briar. Vessa's sister." The wind picked up. The ocean roared behind them, louder now, or maybe Leora was just hearing it differently. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, bruised and heavy. Leora's hands shook. "My mother never told me she had a sister." "I know. Why?" Ashen's eyes went distant. "Because Vessa left her here. Alone. Pregnant. After Cullen drowned." Leora felt the words land like stones in her chest. "Briar was pregnant when Cullen died," Ashen continued, his voice low and careful. "Vessa couldn't handle it. The grief, the house, the water. So she packed up and left. Said she'd come back. She never did." Leora's throat closed. "Briar had the baby here," Ashen said. "A girl. She named her Senna, after your half-sister. The first Senna, the one your mother lost before you were born. The one in the letters," Leora whispered. Ashen nodded. "Briar tried to honor her memory, tried to keep the house alive, but grief doesn't work that way. It just grows." Leora looked down at the photograph. The little girl staring back at her. Dark hair, narrow face, eyes that looked like they were listening to something no one else could hear. "What happened to her?" Leora asked, though she already knew. Ashen's voice cracked. "She walked into the ocean. 9 years old. Same age as the first Senna when she drowned. Same age you were when your father did." Leora's breath caught. "Briar found her on the beach the next morning," Ashen said. "After that, she couldn't stay. She left, 11 years ago. No one knew where she went." "Did she?" "Yes," Ashen said softly. "She drowned herself. 6 months later, they found her 2 towns over." Leora closed her eyes. The wind pulled at her cardigan. The ocean crashed louder now, relentless and rhythmic, like it was counting something. The photograph felt heavier in her hand. "Why didn't my mother tell me?" Leora asked, her voice breaking. Ashen looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity, just understanding. Old and worn and tired. "Because she thought silence was love," he said. "She thought that if she didn't talk about it, you'd be safe, that the water wouldn't find you if you didn't know it was waiting." Leora's chest tightened. "She bought this house 6 months ago," Ashen said, "right after Briar died. I think she finally understood what she'd done, leaving her sister here, running, building a whole life on top of that silence." "She never came," Leora said. "No, she just left it to me." Ashen nodded. "She left you the truth, the only way she knew how." Leora stared at the photograph, at Senna, at the ghost of a girl who looked exactly like her, who carried a name that belonged to another ghost, who walked into the same ocean, that took Cullen and the first Senna, and eventually Briar too. 3 generations. 3 daughters. All of them lost to the same water. Leora's mother had tried to break the cycle by running inland, By staying silent. By giving Leora a childhood free of oceans and grief and the weight of knowing. But grief doesn't disappear when you don't name it. It just waits. Leora folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into her pocket. The letter she handed to Ashen. He took it without reading it, just held it in his rough, dirt-stained hands like it was something fragile. "I'm sorry," he said. Leora looked past him, toward the ocean. The storm clouds were closer now. The wind tasted like rain. "She didn't buy me a house," Leora said quietly. Ashen shook his head. "No." "She bought me the past she'd been running from." "Yes." Leora stood there for a long moment, the wind pulling at her, the ocean roaring, the photograph warm in her pocket. The brass key was still at the house, sitting on the mantel where she'd left it after climbing out of the basement. It had opened the door, but the ocean held the dead. And Leora? She was standing at the edge of it now, finally understanding what her mother had been too afraid to say. Grief is not one story. It is an inheritance, passed down like bone structure, and she was carrying it now. Leora walked back into the house dripping rain and salt. She didn't bother with her shoes, didn't wipe her feet. She just tracked wet sand across the floor and went straight to the fireplace. The boxes of letters were still in the basement where she'd left them. She brought them up one at a time, stacking them beside the hearth until the pile reached her waist. She knelt on the cold floor. Her hands were steady. She opened the first box and pulled out a handful of letters. The envelopes were brittle in her fingers, yellowed and fragile. She could smell the age on them. Old ink, mildew, the faint ghost of lavender that had faded but never quite disappeared. She fed them to the fire one by one. The flames took them eagerly. Paper curled and blackened. Ink bled into ash. Words her mother had written 30 years ago turned to smoke and rose through the chimney into the rain. Leora watched them burn. She didn't read them first. She didn't need to. She already knew what they said. Grief, regret. Apologies that were never sent because Vesa didn't know how to send them. The fire crackled. The distant tide murmured beyond the open window. Salt air mixed with smoke, heavy and sharp. Leora fed more letters into the flames. Box after box, year after year. Decades of silence going up in smoke. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad anymore. She was just letting go. Halfway through the third box, she found the last letter. It was different from the others. Newer. The paper wasn't yellowed. The envelope wasn't brittle. The postmark read 3 weeks before Vesa died. Leora's hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was her mother's. Still neat, still careful, but shakier now. Like her hands had been tired. Like writing had hurt. Leora, I couldn't save her. I thought if I stayed away from the water, you'd be safe. I thought silence was love. I thought if I never spoke about Cullen or Senna or Briar or this house, the grief wouldn't follow us. I was wrong. It followed me everywhere. It lived in my chest. It made a home there. And I carried it alone because I thought that's what mothers do. They carry the weight so their daughters don't have to. But all I did was pass it to you in a different form. The house is yours now. So is the truth. I bought it because I finally understood. Running didn't save me. It just postponed the drowning. I'm sorry I ran. I'm sorry I stayed silent. I'm sorry I made you inherit this without explaining why. The ocean took everyone I loved. But it didn't take you, and maybe that's the only thing I ever did right. I hope you can forgive me, but I'll understand if you can't. Vesa. Leora read it once, then twice. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She folded the letter carefully and held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of her mother's words in her hands. The rain drummed against the windows. The fire crackled. The ocean whispered beyond the glass. She thought about forgiveness, about whether she could give it, whether Vesa even deserved it. And she realized. She didn't know. Maybe forgiveness wasn't the point. Maybe understanding was enough. Leora stood and walked to the fireplace. She held the letter over the flames for a long breath. Then she let it go. The paper caught instantly. The ink curled and blackened. Her mother's words disappeared into smoke and ash. Leora watched until there was nothing left. The brass key sat on the mantel where she'd placed it after coming inside. She picked it up and held it in her palm. It was warm, not from anyone holding it. Just warm. She didn't need it anymore. It had opened the basement. It had unlocked the past. But the past didn't need more doors opened. It just needed to be seen. And now it had been. Leora set the key back on the mantel. Not hidden, not thrown away. Just placed, gently, like something that had served its purpose and could rest now. The photograph of Senna was still in her pocket. She pulled it out and looked at the little girl's face one last time. Dark hair, narrow chin, eyes that looked like they were listening to something no one else could hear. Leora didn't look like her anymore. Or maybe she did. Maybe they both looked like grief, like inherited silence, like daughters who were born carrying weight they didn't choose. But Leora was still here, and Senna wasn't. And that difference, that one small, impossible difference, meant something. Leora walked to the window and opened it wider. The rain had softened to mist. The ocean was quieter now. The storm had passed. She stood there breathing the salt air, holding the photograph, feeling the warmth of the fire at her back and the cold of the rain on her face. She didn't forgive her mother, but she understood her, and maybe that was enough. Leora walked back into the house dripping rain and salt. She didn't bother with her shoes, didn't wipe her feet. She just tracked wet sand across the floor and went straight to the fireplace. The boxes of letters were still in the basement where she'd left them. She brought them up one at a time, stacking them beside the hearth until the pile reached her waist. She knelt on the cold floor. Her hands were steady. She opened the first box and pulled out a handful of letters. The envelopes were brittle in her fingers, yellowed and fragile. She could smell the age on them. Old ink, mildew, the faint ghost of lavender that had faded but never quite disappeared. She fed them to the fire one by one. The flames took them so eagerly. Paper curled and blackened. Ink bled into ash. Words her mother had written 30 years ago turned to smoke and rose through the chimney into the rain. Leora watched them burn. She didn't read them first. She didn't need to. She already knew what they said. Grief, regret, apologies that were never sent because Vesa didn't know how to send them. The fire crackled. The distant tide murmured beyond the open window. Salt air mixed with smoke, heavy and sharp. Leora fed more letters into the flames, box after box, year after year. Decades of silence going up in smoke. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad anymore. She was just letting go. Halfway through the third box, she found the last letter. It was different from the others. Newer. The paper wasn't yellowed. The envelope wasn't brittle. The postmark read 3 weeks before Vesa died. Leora's hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was her mother's. Still neat. Still careful, but shakier now. Like her hands had been tired. Like writing had hurt. Leora, I couldn't save her. I thought if I stayed away from the water, you'd be safe. I thought silence was love. I thought if I never spoke about Cullen or Senna or Briar or this house, the grief wouldn't follow us. I was wrong. It followed me everywhere. It lived in my chest. It made a home there. and I carried it alone because I thought that's what mothers do. They carry the weight so their daughters don't have to. But all I did was pass it to you in a different form. The house is yours now. So is the truth. I bought it because I finally understood. Running didn't save me. It just postponed the drowning. I'm sorry I ran. I'm sorry I stayed silent. I'm sorry I made you inherit this without explaining why. The ocean took everyone I loved. But it didn't take you, and maybe that's the only thing I ever did right. I hope you can forgive me, but I'll understand if you can't. Vesa. Leora read it once, then twice. Her throat tightened. Her eyes burned. But she didn't cry. She folded the letter carefully and held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of her mother's words in her hands. The rain drummed against the windows. The fire crackled. The ocean whispered beyond the glass. She thought about forgiveness, about whether she could give it, whether Vesa even deserved it. And she realized she didn't know. Maybe forgiveness wasn't the point. Maybe understanding was enough. Leora stood and walked to the fireplace. She held the letter over the flames for a long breath. Then she let it go. The paper caught instantly. The ink curled and blackened. Her mother's words disappeared into smoke and ash. Leora watched until there was nothing left. The brass key sat on the mantel where she'd placed it after coming inside. She picked it up and held it in her palm. It was warm. Not from anyone holding it. Just warm. She didn't need it anymore. It had opened the basement. It had unlocked the past. But the past didn't need more doors opened. It just needed to be seen. And now it had been. Leora set the key back on the mantel. Not hidden. Not thrown away. Just placed. Gently. Like something that had served its purpose and could rest now. The photograph of Senna was still in her pocket. She pulled it out and looked at the little girl's face one last time. Dark hair, narrow chin, eyes that looked like they were listening to something no one else could hear. Leora didn't look like her anymore. Or maybe she did. Maybe they both looked like grief, like inherited silence, like daughters who were born carrying weight they didn't choose. But Leora was still here, and Senna wasn't. And that difference, that one small, impossible difference, meant something. Leora walked to the window and opened it wider. The rain had softened to mist. The ocean was quieter now. The storm had passed. She stood there breathing the salt air, holding the photograph, feeling the warmth of the fire at her back and the cold of the rain on her face. She didn't forgive her mother, but she understood her, and maybe that was enough. Leora woke the next morning to sunlight. Not the dim, underwater light that had greeted her when she first arrived. This was clear, golden, the kind of light that made dust motes look like they were floating out on purpose. She lay in bed for a long time, listening to the ocean beyond the window. It sounded different now, calmer. Or maybe she was just hearing it differently. She'd slept through the night, for the first time since her mother died. No dreams, no waking at 3 a.m. with her chest tight and her breath shallow. Just sleep, deep and quiet, and almost peaceful. Leora got up slowly and walked to the window. The shutters were still peeling. The paint still curled away from the wood in long strips. But the light was good, and the ocean was just water now, not a threat, not a keeper of the dead, just water. She decided to stay, not forever. She didn't know if she could promise forever. But for now, for however long now lasted. She found a can of blue paint in the shed behind the house. The color was almost the same as the old paint, just fresher, less faded, less tired. She started with the front shutters. The paintbrush felt good in her hand, steady, purposeful. Each stroke covered a little more of the peeling wood, a little more of the salt damage and the years of neglect. It wasn't fixing anything. but it was caring for something, and maybe that was enough. Ashen came by in the afternoon with lavender cuttings from his garden. "Thought you might want these," he said, holding them carefully like they were something fragile. Leora took them. They smelled like her mother, like the letters, like memory trying to root itself somewhere new. "Thank you," she said. They planted them together in the small patch of earth beside the front steps. The soil was sandy and damp, hard to work with, but the lavender didn't seem to mind. Ashen said they were hardy, that they'd grow even here, where salt air and wind made everything else struggle. Leora pressed the dirt around the roots with her fingers. It felt cool, alive. "You staying?" Ashen asked quietly. "For now," Leora said. He nodded. "That's good." She looked at him. "Is it?" "Yeah," he said. "Some places need people who understand them. This house has been empty a long time." Leora didn't know if she understood the house yet, but she was trying, and maybe that was the same thing. After Ashen left, she walked to the beach. The sand was still cold beneath her bare feet. The tide was still rhythmic and endless, but she didn't feel pulled toward it anymore. Didn't feel like it was waiting for her to make a choice. She just walked. Every morning after that, she did the same thing. Woke with the sun, painted a little more, walked the shore without fear or expectation. The ocean stopped feeling like a question. It was just there, breathing, moving, existing the way water does. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter, not to send, just to say. The paper was clean and white. The pen was blue. Her handwriting looked nothing like her mother's, messier, less controlled, more human. She began, "I found the house. I found the truth. I'm not angry anymore." She paused. That wasn't quite right. She crossed it out and started again. "I found the house. I found the truth. I don't know if I'm angry anymore, but I know I understand now. Better." She kept writing. "You thought silence would protect me. Maybe it did in some ways. But it also left me empty-handed when I needed to know where I came from. I'm not going to run the way you did, but I'm also not going to drown. I'm just going to stay, for now, and see what that feels like. The lavender is growing. The ocean is just water. The house is just shelter. I think that's all they ever needed to be." She folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer beside the photograph of Senna. The brass key sat on the mantel where she'd left it. She looked at it sometimes when she passed by. It didn't glow. It didn't hum. It just sat there, small and ordinary, like it had never been anything else. That night, Leora opened all the windows. The salt air filled the house, cool and clean and alive. She stood in the kitchen and breathed it in, feeling it settle into her lungs, her chest, her bones. The ocean whispered beyond the glass. The lavender rustled softly in the evening breeze. And Leora. She stood in the house her mother left her and felt, for the first time, like she wasn't haunting it. She was living in it, and that was different. That was enough. 6 months later. The house still stands by the water. The shutters are blue again. The windows catch the light differently now. Not underwater anymore, just clear. Leora still lives there. She walks the beach every morning, barefoot, slow. The tide pulls back and she follows it out to where the sand is dark and wet and firm beneath her feet. Sometimes she speaks names into the wind. Cullen. Senna. Briar. Her voice is soft, clear, not loud enough to carry over the ocean, but loud enough to be heard by whatever listens. She doesn't know if it matters, but it feels like it does. The lavender has bloomed, purple and fragrant and alive. It grows beside the front steps where she and Ashen planted it, roots deep in the sandy soil that shouldn't hold anything but does anyway. She cuts a stem sometimes and brings it inside, sets it on the windowsill above the sink. The scent fills the kitchen like her mother is there, sitting at the table, watching her without speaking. It's not haunting, it's just company. Ashen comes by once a week with bread or coffee or nothing at all. They sit on the porch and watch the tide come in. He asks her once if she's thought about selling the house. No, she says. He nods. Good. Why good? Because some places aren't meant to be left behind twice. Lior looks at him. His face is lined with old grief, old weather, old years spent watching water take things and never give them back. You think the house needed me? She asks. I think you needed it, he says quietly, and maybe that's the same thing. She doesn't argue. The brass key still sits on the mantel. She touches it sometimes when she passes by. It's warm now, not from anyone holding it, just warm the way old things get when they've been cared for long enough. It doesn't open anything anymore. It just marks what was carried, what was survived, what remains. Memory itself, solid and small and impossibly heavy. One evening, Leora stands at the edge of the water with a photograph in her pocket and the ocean breathing in front of her. The sky is turning pink and orange. The tide is pulling back. She reaches into her pocket and pulls out the photograph of Senna, the little girl on the beach, the shell in her hands, the face that looks so much like Leora's it used to hurt to see. It doesn't hurt anymore. Leora looks at the photograph for a long time. Then she tucks it back into her pocket and turns toward the house. The lights are on inside. Warm. Golden. Hers. The ocean whispers her name. But now, she knows its weight. She knows the names it holds, the daughters it took, the fathers and sisters and aunts who couldn't carry the silence anymore, and let the water carry them instead. She knows the pattern, and she is standing outside of it, not because she's stronger, not because she's braver, because she stayed, because she spoke the names, because she let the grief root itself in lavender and fresh paint and morning walks instead of letting it pull her under. The ocean doesn't forgive, it just remembers, and sometimes remembering is the only mercy we need. Leora walks back to the house. The sand is cool beneath her feet. The wind pulls at her hair. The lavender rustles softly beside the steps. She opens the door and steps inside. The brass key sits on the mantel, catching the last light of the day. The photograph rests in her pocket, warm against her chest. The ocean hums beyond the glass, patient and endless. And Leora, she is home. Not because she found answers, not because the grief disappeared, but because some inheritances break us, and others teach us how to stand.